I had ventured out camping in the familiar forests of Colorado, which was a couple of hours away from where I lived. I enjoyed these trips every few months, especially when the weather was pleasant. My camp was already set up, and I had spent the past 2 days arranging my tent and indulging in some fishing, not doing much else. On the third day, I decided to go for a hike just north of my campsite. This area lacked established trails, so I was simply meandering up the mountainside in a general direction. I was familiar with the landmarks near my camp, and I had all the necessary equipment to ensure I wouldn't get lost. I was simply enjoying the walk, and it was around midday at this point. As I continued uphill, I noticed a column of smoke billowing from behind me, and it seemed to be coming from close to my campsite. Intrigued, I tried to get a better view and, as far as I could tell, something was burning either at my campsite or in the immediate vicinity. I hastily made my way back, filled with concern about what might be happening. I couldn't comprehend how a fire could have started, as I was certain I hadn't left a fire unattended. As I got closer to the base of the smoke column, it became evident that the fire wasn't directly at my camp. I reached my campsite and discovered that everything was perfectly fine. The source of the smoke, however, seemed to be in the woods nearby, just out of my line of sight. I contemplated investigating it, but it was probably someone else's campfire at this point. It was indeed odd that someone else was out here in the exact location I was. Given the absence of trails leading to this spot, I didn't want to stumble upon unknown individuals, so I decided to stay at my campsite. At that time, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling of being watched, even though I couldn't see anyone else around. I didn't think much more about it and continued with my day, tending to various tasks around the campsite. Around an hour passed before I casually looked around, and I felt my body stiffen as I spotted a man standing in the forest. His presence was entirely unexpected, and he appeared to be gazing in my direction. I, in my obliviousness, raised my arm and offered a nervous wave. However, the man didn't wave back. He was too far away for me to discern whether he was even looking at me, but he was facing in the direction of my campsite. He stood there for almost 15 minutes before finally disappearing into the woods. The encounter left me deeply unsettled. His actions seemed utterly inexplicable. There was no apparent reason for someone to act that way. I waited for a few hours, remaining vigilant and constantly scanning my surroundings. Then, just as night fell, I noticed a flickering light to my left. Another campfire was visible in the dense forest close by. Strangely, it wasn't in the direction of the earlier smoke. It was near the spot where I had seen the man earlier. I scrutinized the base of the campfire, but it didn't appear that anyone was present. I surveyed the dark forest, and my eyes locked onto something chilling, a face peering back at me from behind a bush, only 10 to 15 feet away. My heart raced as I met the gaze of this figure. It seemed like he believed I couldn't see him, yet he continued watching me in silence. After a few seconds, the figure retreated, moving slowly, and crouched back into the depths of the woods. I remained on high alert, monitoring my surroundings for the entire night, but I didn't encounter anything further. At first light, I packed up and left, walking as quickly as I could until I reached my car. I couldn't explain what had been happening, but I had an overwhelming sense of foreboding, and I didn't want to find out the extent of the danger that may have been lurking. I'm a 26-year-old man, and this incident occurred in the spring of 2021. I was taking a solo vacation, and was fortunate that one of my friends owned a cabin in the area I intended to visit. It was a picturesque, cozy place, which was precisely what I desired for a relaxing getaway. This cabin was quite remote, approximately 40 minutes outside the nearest town. Most of that time was spent on a slow, unpaved road, making the cabin feel even more secluded. Upon my arrival, I spent about an hour standing outside soaking in the surroundings. I was captivated by the tranquility of the place. Afterward, I prepared an early dinner and spent some time on my phone. As the daylight was still abundant, I decided to go for a brief walk. There were several small trails adjacent to the cabin which I had noticed earlier. I checked with my friend, whom I'll refer to as Brandon, to confirm that these were indeed trails and not paths that would lead me astray. He assured me that there was no need to worry, and that the nearest trail, located at the back of the cabin, was straightforward and would lead me in and out of the woods without any complications. This suited me perfectly, so I donned my hiking boots and headed down the trail. The trail was not meticulously maintained, but it wasn't overly challenging either. My only concern was getting lost, but I soon realized it was straightforward and impossible to veer off course. I walked for about 30 minutes, appreciating the natural beauty around me and allowing my thoughts to wander. That's when I heard something that made me pause. I heard a man's voice, speaking loudly with a harsh tone. It seemed distant, somewhere to my right, but I couldn't see the speaker. It sounded like he was addressing someone or even yelling at them.
I'm a police officer in our small local department. Our shift schedule rotates between 10 to 12 hours, often switching from overnight to early morning and back again. On one shift, I received a call about a group of teenagers trespassing in an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. This location was a common hangout for mischievous youngsters, and I expected a routine call to disperse them. However, that night turned out to be different. The moment I arrived at the deserted hospital, I noticed a flashlight moving rapidly across the second-story windows. It seemed like someone was running through the darkened hallways. I got ready, called out, and waited for a response. Silence enveloped the building. The eerie quiet, broken only by the creaking of the old structure, sent shivers down my spine. I ventured upstairs, guided by my flashlight. It was considerably darker up there, and the footsteps were the only sounds I heard. When I reached the hallway, I found a room with a locked door on one side and another unlocked one on the opposite end. The unlocked room was empty except for a boarded-up window piquing my curiosity. Peering through a crack in the wood, I spotted a figure approaching the hospital from the field nearby. Alarmed, I alerted my partner, Chris, about the approaching person. As we watched, footsteps echoed on the stairs, confirming our presence was not alone. Tensions rose, and as the man reached the top, he stepped into the hallway, unlocking the door while facing away from us. But as he turned around, our eyes locked, and the silence weighed heavily on us. He proceeded into the room on the opposite side of the hallway. We seized the opportunity and sprinted down the stairs, but the man quickly realized our escape. He followed us out the door, leaving us no choice but to flee through the field to our car. We drove away, both of us in stunned silence. Despite a thorough investigation, the two teenagers we expected to find in the hospital were never seen again, leaving us with a mystery that continues to this day.
This was unexpected and unsettling, and it made me wonder if something was wrong. I couldn't understand the language the man was speaking, but it was clear that he was agitated. What puzzled me was that there was no response from anyone else. It was as if he was yelling into the void. Uncertain about what to do, I decided to approach cautiously to determine if everything was okay. I didn't want to leave the trail and risk getting lost, but I also felt a sense of unease. The sun would set in a couple of hours, and I didn't want to be wandering in the woods when darkness fell. As I moved closer to the source of the noise, the man's angry voice grew louder, and it appeared that he was just off the trail, but I still couldn't see him. Eventually, he fell silent, and I was left in an eerie quiet. In my gut, I felt that something was not right. I called out to Brandon, thinking it might be him, but there was no response. I called out again, louder this time, but still, no answer. The silence was unsettling, and my instincts were telling me that I should head back. However, as I turned to retrace my steps, I saw a flashlight beam in the woods ahead of me, moving around as though someone was walking with it. It was near one of the other trails, and the light appeared to be getting closer. I was momentarily relieved, thinking it might be Brandon. But then, just before I could see the person holding the flashlight, it abruptly turned off and the footsteps ceased. It was dark, and the forest fell silent once more. I called out for Brandon, but there was no response. The knot of anxiety in my stomach tightened. I felt that the person with the flashlight was still out there watching me. As I stood there, my unease growing, I realized that waiting for him to reveal himself was not the right course of action. Something about the situation made me decide to leave. So I packed up my things, left the campsite behind, and made my way back to safety. I didn't think I was followed, and I managed to leave the area without further incident. When I contacted the police the next day, they were unable to find any trace of Brandon. His disappearance remained a mystery, and it was believed that he may have encountered the same person I had, who may have taken him. It's a haunting thought, wondering whether things would have turned out differently if I had accompanied him on the first day, or if I too would have disappeared. Before the trip, my manager had to push back my requested days off by a day, creating a scheduling snag. I communicated this with my friend, whom I'll call Brandon, and he decided to hike out to the campsite a day ahead of me. He insisted on spending the first night there alone, stating that he would enjoy it. I had no reason to object, so I agreed, and he promised to notify me once he set everything up. As I embarked on my journey the following morning, I sent a text to Brandon to inform him that I was on my way. Unfortunately, I lost phone service and I didn't receive a response. However, I didn't think much of it, as various factors could have contributed to the lack of communication. Upon my arrival at the campsite, something felt amiss. Brandon was nowhere to be found. I searched the tent and its vicinity, but he was conspicuously absent. I didn't initially panic, assuming that he might have gone fishing by the nearby river or embarked on a hike to soak in some scenic views. This area had numerous spots he could explore, including trails, and I couldn't be certain where he had ventured. I dropped my bag and set up my tent, lighting a fire to heat up some canned food. I reasoned that Brandon would likely return by mid-afternoon since he had set out early. However, as the day progressed, anxiety began to gnaw at me. When 5 o'clock rolled around, I became increasingly concerned. I attempted to look for signs of his presence, hoping for shoe prints or some indication of his whereabouts. Unfortunately, the area around the campsite was marked with numerous footprints that led in various directions, making it impossible to discern which path he had taken. My phone still had no service, and there was no way for me to determine if something was wrong. My only viable option was to stay put and hope that Brandon would return. I couldn't risk going off on my own with the night rapidly approaching. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I threw more wood onto the fire, anxiously waiting for his return. However, at that moment, I noticed a flashlight beam sweeping through the forest, just beyond the trees. The light moved around as if someone was walking with it. I thought that it must be Brandon returning from his exploration, and relief washed over me. But suddenly, the light extinguished, and the footsteps ceased. My calls to Brandon were met with silence, and my gut instinct told me that something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows, and my unease grew. The person with the flashlight remained out there in the darkness, and I was seized by an unshakable sense of dread. In that moment, I knew that I had to leave. I quickly packed my belongings and left the campsite, my senses on high alert, but I didn't detect any pursuit. While I escaped without further incident, it wasn't until the next day that the police could get involved. We returned to the campsite and found it undisturbed, but there was no sign of Brandon. His trail showed that he had wandered off one of the trails and deeper into the woods. Another set of footprints beside his hinted at the presence of someone else. Brandon never reappeared, and the investigation into his disappearance went cold after a few days. It's a haunting thought that he may have been taken by the same person who had been lurking in the woods,